1. In the time where I spent the majority of my teenage years, I got to know the guy who ran the kiosk for one of the local gas stations. His name was Kelly. Probably a few years older than me, I was about 16 at the time, and we became what I would say good acquaintances. He was pretty distinctive looking, curly hair on the slender and tall side, liked to wear a lot of dark colors with a battle jacket, usually a jacket often of denim material, with many patches of rock and metal bands sewn in. This was the early 90s. We were always friendly towards each other. He at times would sell me cigarettes, underage again, well before any kind of real regulations were set in place for doing so. Fast forward a few years, I was about 18 and pregnant. I wasn't showing yet, and I was trying to keep the info of said pregnancy to myself. I had stopped at the kiosk one day to gas up my car, and Kelly was working. For some reason, after these few years of friendly conversation, etc., he chose this time to see if I would possibly go out with him sometime. I didn't mention the pregnancy. I honestly had no idea what to say. I stumbled over my words and somehow got across to him that it wouldn't be a good idea. I felt terrible. I was living in a different town at the time, so I definitely didn't see him quite as often. But now, of course, it was awkward. Fast forward again, maybe a year later. I was now a young mom and driving with my daughter in my car right around the corner from the kiosk where Kelly had been working. As I drove, I could see a figure on the side of the road hitchhiking. It was Kelly, unmistakable. I didn't stop. I didn't stop because I had my daughter in the car with me, and it was a split decision on my part to drive right past him. Kelly stared at me as I drove past. He knew my '87 Thunderbird. I got home about an hour later and called a good friend of mine. I told her I had seen Kelly hitchhiking earlier, which seemed weird because he lived right in town. It would have been easy enough for him to walk to where he needed to go. It took me a moment to realize she was completely silent. "Dude, you don't know?" she said. "No? Know what?" I replied. "Kelly killed himself a few days ago. His mom found him." At the time, I was opening a can of SpaghettiOs to put on the stove for my daughter. I dropped it. I told her that was purely impossible. There was no way the guy I saw today hitchhiking wasn't Kelly. It couldn't be anyone but Kelly. But it was true. Some of you might wonder why I didn't know about it since we were friends. But again, we weren't friends that hung out. We didn't run in the same circle of friends. This was literally a few years of just seeing each other at the kiosk where he worked. Part of me tried to figure out what I was more shocked and upset about. Was it the fact that he was in so much despair that he had done this to himself, or the fact that I had seen him well after he had passed? And the other part of me, what if I stopped to pick him up that day? That's the thought that still haunts me. 2. So I made a dream catcher for a friend as a baby shower gift. I made it completely for aesthetics because it went with her bohemian-vibed nursery. Well, looking back, this was when all the strange stuff started. So my first question is, are dream catchers some sort of portal, or do they attract a spirit into a house? Or make them more prominent in being able to communicate with them? Strange things have happened since, such as waking up in the morning to the smell of coffee brewing. I don't even drink coffee. And I was the only one in the house besides my almost 2-year-old son. Also, I have experienced a stereo turning on with very loud static out of nowhere. It nearly scared my son to death. Very important pictures and mementos randomly breaking, and just a sense of there being something else lurking around. A little context. My father died in this house after a brief stint of cancer. Because I was dog-sitting that night I smelled the coffee. I was actually sleeping around the area where he passed. I occasionally see him in dreams, and there's part of me that's wanted him to contact me in spirit. I don't feel this is an evil spirit, just one trying to get my attention. For example, he never got to meet his grandkids, but knew of my sister-in-law being pregnant before he died. One of the pics that got broken was all 3 grandkids in a frame with one of those "grandkids are so special, etc., etc." sayings. The memento that was broken was a tiny heart porcelain box that my aunt, who is sick with breast cancer, gave my mom. I'm thinking it may be a sign to her illness. When I saw her last month, her markers were up after a period of stagnation. Would a spirit put such thoughts into these acts? Lastly, there's a part of me that wants to communicate with my dad, but I'm scared. Scared of the unknown, scared of what he might say, scared that this could be real. I've always believed in spirits and felt super connected to them when I was a young child, to ancestors. I have sage, but I'm not ready to smudge yet. Any advice? 3. This occurred on Hallows Eve night, around 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Being a firm believer in the paranormal, I can safely say that this was one of the most psychologically damaging experiences of my life, but at the same time, one of the most addicting. My dad said that he and his former girlfriend went to an abandoned, unnamed graveyard in a remote part of South Carolina. The locals call it witches and warlocks due to the 1600s to 1700s graves. The area just in front of it is a very old farm, that's now private property, in which a well was used to drown slaves. Long story short, my dad and his girlfriend heard noises while traversing the graves, catching them this night on his camera. He said that it sounded like sizzling coming from the trees, but the closest thing that could have made that noise was a good 12 miles away. The sound was getting louder until Dad and his girlfriend drove away from the place in a panic. Fast forward 19 years later, my dad and I were driving to the same area as he told me the story about the well. Unfortunately, I couldn't see it due to the darkness. After being scared by a black dog and driving deeper into the old abandoned woods, I began to feel a sense of anticipation. I gazed into the dimly lit treetops, the gently paved dirt road, and even among the square fences that beyond it housed the field with the well. I remember seeing something like a pareidolia of hanged bodies, even seeing faces in the tall grass. I didn't really think of it much at the time. My dad explained that the deeper you go into the forest, the creepier it gets, and he wasn't kidding. The anticipation was increasing by the minute. We were at the end of the forest, and the abandoned shed of the farm was still visible, and at the corner of my eye, I could see the tips of unmarked graves in the tall crabgrass. Feeling excited now, I gazed into the darkening graveyard through my open window. I blinked once and saw something hovering over the grave. It looked so reminiscent of a floating white dress, with puffy sleeves and a fading hem, and I could just barely see a faint scene of white arms poking through the sleeves, and to this day the image is burned into my head like a photo. A sickening feeling suddenly destroyed my excitement. I felt like throwing up so badly. I started begging for my dad to leave the area. I felt like I shouldn't have gone there. I panicked and told my dad about the dress I saw. He brushed it off as a smudge on the window, but the window was down. Our flashlights gleamed across the dead grass, hoping to find something else. I felt like crying, and I begged my dad to drive back. I wanted him to go back to the place to have me see the dress once again. I have to go back. I have to go back and see it again, I cried, feeling the nausea rise up in my throat. My dad snickered and said that it was probably what I ate, but this wasn't that kind of nausea. This was the kind from fear. Cold fear crawled over my skin, and my blood was frozen. But as I shined a flashlight towards the graves, I saw no dress, no body. It was here. The dress was right here. I pointed to the top of a roughly 3-foot-tall grave, breathing heavily and fast. My chest was tightening as more fear went up my spine. I've never felt something like that. I felt hopeless. But now I'm addicted to going back to that place. I wanted to see the dress again. Maybe this Hallows Eve will get another sight of the place. I'm afraid of going back, but at the same time, I'm addicted to it. 4. So this happened last year. My aunt likes to travel a lot now that she's retired, and she'll ask me to take her to the airport. She lives about an hour outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a place that's pretty rural. She doesn't like traveling out of the Philadelphia International Airport, and will instead go to Newark Liberty International Airport. So last year she decided to go to South and Central America for a month, and asked me to come to her house to drive her since she didn't trust my brother to actually show up when he said he would. I met her at her place the night before, went to bed for a few hours, and then we left in her car at 1 a.m. so she could get to the airport in time. We decided to take her car because it's a mid-sized SUV and held her luggage better than my sedan did. I guess we had been on the road for about 20 minutes. I'm not entirely sure because my perception of the passage of time isn't amazing. But we had to drive through a lot of small little old villages. Not sure what else to call them. They were basically clumps of 10 houses in a small area. The homes were all super close to the road, like basically right on top of it, which helped note them as being a lot older. None of the lights were on, not even candle lamps in the windows. And if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, you know what I'm talking about with those lamps. They're everywhere. The area had a lot of woods. It was all just very creepy and very foggy out. We were driving along, and all of a sudden we came up on something. It was facing toward a telephone pole off to the right of the car. The pole was just in front of a garage or small barn structure. All I could see was the back of its head, completely white, no hair. Its hands and its forearms were also totally white. It looked like it was wearing a dark shirt or something of that nature, but it was facing away from us, leaning into the telephone pole with his arms up against the pole and its head against its arms, or at least a stance similar to that. The worst feeling I've ever felt rose up in my chest when I saw it. I felt my heart almost stop and drop into my stomach. I felt sick and terrified. All I knew was that whatever it was, I didn't want it to turn around. No matter what. I knew it couldn't be allowed to turn around, or I would regret it. I've seen a lot of really weird things in my life and felt a lot of really weird sensations. I've always been super sensitive to the energy in homes, and I have straight up seen ghosts in my parents' home, one of which I am very wary of. The other I am comforted by, but that's a different story for a different time. But this was actually terrifying. I cannot explain the immense feeling of dread and horror I experienced in that moment to you. You could only understand it if you've experienced it yourself. We passed by it so quickly, and it was so late that I thought I must have imagined it. But that feeling stuck with me. I didn't say anything to my aunt. I thought she didn't see it either. But about 10 seconds after we went past it, she says, "Did you..." and then a long pause. "Did you see that thing?" We talked about it. She described to me exactly what I saw, and I knew right then and there that I was going to be terrified to drive back to her home, to switch cars at 4 or 5 a.m. when I got back to her place from the airport, by myself. And all I could think is that I didn't want that thing to be there, because I would hit it if it came into the road, and I wouldn't stop to check if I did. It wasn't going to get me. Luckily, it wasn't there when I drove past the same area again on the way to her home, and believe me, I was hyper-aware the entire way there. I was even terrified to walk from her front door to my car. I ran and locked myself in as soon as I sat down and shut the car door. The next time I drove her to the airport, I looked for it, but it wasn't there. I haven't seen it since. I've only told a couple friends about it, and one of them and her best friend saw something similar peeking at them around the backside of her house when they were sitting in her car one night. She also lives in rural Pennsylvania, 19 miles from me, 40-minute drive. And I'm 22-ish miles outside of Philly, also roughly 40 minutes drive. She also lives out in the woods. Have any of you ever experienced something like this? I saw a video once of something that just had a white head and white long legs walking around, and it didn't look like that. This thing was tall and had distinct arms and legs. It had no hair whatsoever on its body. I don't know if it had facial features because it was faced towards the pole, almost like it was counting for hide and go seek with its arms up. It might have been hugging on to the pole. It wore something black, and I experienced the worst, most deeply jolting fear in its presence. And I was only near to it for a few seconds. 5. A few years ago, a friend and I were talking about various unexplained phenomena, when we realized we both had a huge interest in the paranormal and unexplained. After talking about a few famous unexplained mysteries and conspiracy theories, he started telling me about his own experiences with a supposedly haunted forest. The forest was to the back of an old nursing home his mum worked at, and just beside a large cemetery. The nursing home had previously belonged to a wealthy family, but during World War II they allowed it to become a hospital for those wounded during the Blitzkrieg. Shortly after the war, they allowed it to be converted into a care hospital for the elderly, and it's still there today. My friend's earliest experience with the forest was taking his dog for a walk through the forest and having them react erratically when they tried to take them to an old, decaying and overrun section, previously an apple orchard surrounded by a large gate and wall. Not thinking much of it at the time, he noticed neither his own, his cousins, or any of his friends' dogs would go near it. They would all start growling and pulling furiously to avoid going in. As he got older, he mostly forgot about the strange behavior and lost interest in the forest. He was reminded of it many years later when he was older, and his mum, having briefly worked at the nursing home just outside the forest, opened up about some of the bizarre things that used to happen while she was working there. When she started, she heard a number of the nurses talking about how the building was haunted, supposedly by the ghosts of 2 little girls, and how a lot of bizarre things tended to happen. Being that she wasn't superstitious, she didn't really pay much notice, until it started happening while she was on shift. It started relatively small. Things would go missing or get moved around. Doors and windows they closed would be opened, and they'd hear noises coming from around the building. Being that a number of the patients had very poor memories and were suffering from various mental ailments, she mostly wrote it off as them forgetting what they'd been doing or where they'd been. She said the day she started believing was when she came off of her break and went into the common room to move a few of the physically impaired residents, and they were nowhere to be found. She checked the entire ground of the building and around the outside but couldn't find them anywhere. After checking everywhere else, she searched the 1st and 2nd floors, only to find them in their rooms getting ready for bed. This bewildered her, as the residents often needed nurses' support to get out of a chair, never mind up a flight of stairs, and she was the only resident tending to them that night. When she asked how they were able to get up the stairs, the residents all replied, "Those 2 lovely little girls helped us." This freaked her out, as visiting hours had finished a number of hours before, and as far as she could see the doors were all locked, and there was no one in the building. She quit shortly after, and moved to another care facility. I loved hearing the stories about this place, although I was skeptical at first. As it happens, my granddad lived quite near this place for years, so the next time I saw him, I mentioned to him the stories I'd heard. Being a real no-nonsense character, he rolled his eyes, and mentioned how it wasn't the first time he'd heard people talking nonsense about ghosts up there. Although he dismissed it as rubbish, that confirmed for me that it wasn't just my friend and his mum that believed there was something going on. Multiple people had reported something bizarre happening. This got me excited, and I told my friend about what I'd heard and asked if he'd be willing to go up one night and see if we could find anything. As it happened, we both worked in the same shop and often worked the same shifts, finishing at midnight. This meant it was easy enough for us to take a run up after work and have a wander around to see if we could find anything bizarre. Although nervous, we got ourselves pumped up, grabbed some torches and dived in sometime after midnight, only to find nothing. We came back a little disappointed, but we still thought it was a cool experience, so we decided to go back. A few months later, we were working the same shift, finishing at midnight. So we took another run up, only to have another, unfortunately, plain and uneventful experience. 2 or 3 more times we went up, and 2 or 3 more times we saw and heard nothing more than a few animals running around. Major bummer. Some time went by, and we lost interest and stopped trying, until we were talking about horror films again after finishing a midnight shift, and on a whim decided to give it one last try. This was the night we had the encounter that terrified the both of us. It took us a little time to get ready that night, as we weren't prepared, so it was probably closer to 1 a.m. and pitch black before we got there. We had come to a small clearing between the trees, and were walking through. On both our left and right, we were surrounded by thick hedges and trees with little visibility. As we were navigating our way through, we were both totally silent. and as I climbed over a tree root, I heard the very distinct laughter of a young girl. I froze on the spot. The laughter sounded like it had come from 3 foot away from me. Being a rational guy, in that instant, my mind started telling me it was just an animal, don't panic, maybe you imagined it. I looked towards my friend, hoping he'd be behaving as normal, and that he hadn't heard anything, but his face was white as a sheet, and he was frozen in place with an awestruck expression on his face. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there frozen, looking terrified at each other. Suddenly, from just behind him we heard it again, the laughter of a little girl. Neither of us said anything or made any kind of signal. We both just started sprinting. We didn't say a word to each other the entire time we ran out. When we came to the clearing we entered from, after about 3 minutes of running, we slowed down and eventually stopped. Then we looked at each other again and without saying a word took off running again, until we came to the main road you turn off to get to the forest. At this point we were both exhausted from the running and had to stop to catch our breath. Once we regained composure, we frantically described what we'd heard, confirming to each other that we'd very clearly heard the laughter of 2 little girls, or at least one that someone laughed from both sides of us. We both went home and spent the next few hours ruling out any explanation we could come up with. I stayed up that night listening to the sounds of animals that are found in this region to see if any of them sounded vaguely similar to what I heard, eventually ruling them out. And I know I didn't imagine it, as we both took off running the moment the second laughter occurred without saying a word. That was the last time, for a long time, we went up to the haunted forest at night. That was around 6 years ago, and recently we decided to muster up the courage and have another crack at finding a ghost. I have no idea why. This time we took another friend up, and sadly, or luckily, we didn't have any strange encounters. We're planning to go up again soon, once we have the time, and we're intending to take a lot more photos and audio recordings. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 98. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I'm going to make this the last week as a reminder for questions for the Q&A. No reminder next week, we're about 2 weeks away. Yeah, this is 98, yeah, but about 2 weeks away. Just to make sure I give myself plenty of time to work on the actual video itself, because it's going to be a bit on the beastly size, hopefully. And so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, just pop them in the comment section below of this or any video, and I'll get them capped. I've got most of them done already. I think I've just got about weeks to search through, and we're good, and I'll get those in the Q&A. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.